All right, welcome everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I'm joined again by Mike Princi. A few weeks ago, we spoke about what we mean by risk in M&A, and today we want to drive into some of the drivers of success in M&A, which is how do you actually manage some of the risks. So we all know that deals don't fail because of ambition. They fail because risks aren't identified or aren't corrected or managed consistently. So what we wanted to really talk about today is, hey, it's all broken. Now what do you actually do? And how do you actually deal with the situation? I love that title. I think it's great.
No, it is great. Thanks for having me back again, Pekka. I think this is a great series we're piecing together. With that said, yeah, it's all broken, right? Just by its own nature, when you put two systems, we talked a little bit about systems in the last the broader definition of complete systems, not just the IT systems. When you put these two systems together, something is going to break, whether you intended or not. And you've got a bunch of just hunches about how these businesses are going to go together. And if you stymie any of the evidence that's being brought forward that say, hey, some of these hunches were a little bit wrong, it tends to roll itself out and become somewhat catastrophic in the deal, right? Because as you said, it's not the deal or the deal hypothesis or the diligence or the aspirations that were the reason a deal failed. It's the execution and everything that happens afterwards, and any information that could prevent the execution from failing is really what we're trying to talk about in terms of risk management.
Yeah, and I suppose at the very start, you don't really know what you don't know until you get into the guts of it. So that's always going to be a challenge when you get to that integration phase and you're dealing with the unknown, and you have to move fast, or you're not actually going to have a viable business at the end of the process. So it's a challenge.
Absolutely, and speed matters. So you're in the 100-day plan. You're at your third or fourth meeting, and you're going through the presentations. And those presentations, everyone starts to share with you the update. And a lot of times, you've got a sponsor on, you've got a senior executive on, you might have the founding team that is of the acquired company that you bought, or the leadership team from that acquired company. You've got a pretty high-powered audience. What are you typically seeing in the kinds of things that folks are talking about?
So I think a lot of those update meetings don't actually focus on risk. Personally, what they focus on is some form of progress. Now, sometimes it's KPIs, how many things have we done? Sometimes it is really about tracking where are we going, but it's not necessarily pointing out here are the challenges, here are the things that might kill us, here are the things that are actually going to hurt us or are already hurting us. And sometimes the data just isn't there, right? It's qualitative information as opposed to data-based information. So I think some of these update meetings, they don't focus on risk. They focus on stories about how things are progressing. And sometimes hidden in those stories, in my view, you get semblance of what is that risk, what is actually happening under the hood.
No, I think that's an excellent point, and much like you've seen, I've seen the same. A couple things I want to add to that, right? They do feel like progress reports, and because you have this high-powered audience typically in the room, you tend to have a much more positive or rosy, which is very funny because red and rosy aren't the same things, right? So you tend to see a lot more greens, maybe a few yellows, right? And again, we talked that's a culture issue that brings that back. But a couple other things that I've also seen is it's often like dumping a box of Legos on the table, right? There's all of this set of hidden things that are in there that no one's really clipped together. I've rarely seen integration meetings where it wasn't run by a functional basis. And those meetings are typically that litany of here's where we are from a progress basis. One of the things that I like to do is actually invert those back to the decisions. So, for example, you might have a decision around commercial, right? And there might be risks in HR around retention that are going to affect a commercial outcome. There might be IT risks, there might be finance risks in that when they're just done as a functionally organized group, it loses the decision power around what needs to happen. And again, when they're all greens and yellows, it feels like things are progressing.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, right? I mean, it's all about interdependencies as well, right? So often when you approach these things from a purely functional perspective, you get the intra-function challenges, but actually what is it going to do to the end-to-end process? What is it actually going to do to the overall deal in itself? You just don't know, because actually sometimes those things aren't being knit together. So I think that can cause some challenges often, and I think it's the job of the integration leaders and the functional workstream leaders to make sure they do tie all of that together. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about KPIs, right? KPIs can tell us one thing, but also I think that I mean, KPIs are a great early warning system, don't get me wrong, and they are a great way of actually tracking certain bits of progress. But sometimes that qualitative, oh, this thing is changing, or hey, this causes me concern. Should it not cause you concern? Conversation that can happen in these meetings that can really help to iron out and identify new things that actually might be harming the overall deal.
No, those are important. I love the use of KPIs, right? Because that brings in what I call numeracy, right? The ability to use a number to tell whether you're on or off course. You've got a lot of numbers that sit around the integration, right? A lot of those around how budget's applied, could be the number of people that are retained, could be some really cursory things, but it becomes powerful when you start putting it into something that you're targeting. I'll use HR as a functional example, right? Thinking about what's the cost to serve and being able to talk about it in the numbers that do exist, that evidence you do have. The cost to serve is a total number, and you can start breaking that down by thinking about the number of employees, the number of HR personnel that are involved, the budget, maybe even the number of transactions that are playing out. So if you're a pretty stable company buying a business maybe overseas where there's a high churn rate, you're now going to have to accept the risk or address the risk of two different systems, right? I have this system that's in this stable employment opportunity, and your system's in a place where there is a lot of churn and a lot of disruption. That's going to have an unintended consequence if you haven't been deliberate about that.
Yeah, and I think that brings into the wider context of the integration as well, right? Is as you are merging these things, there's a change management element to this. How do you actually manage the different sides of the people? How do you manage you talk about systems in their wider context, but also the systems in the much narrower context, IT systems, right? How do you make sure that the ecosystems actually function in these scenarios, and make sure that the business processes will continue to operate? So I think there's a lot there in terms of KPIs and tracking and actually building out that picture to start off with, and then tracking it religiously to move things forward. So
yeah, that helps with one of the 3 C's we laid out last week, right? The communications piece. It is inherently easier to look at a number and know, do I need to dig in as a leader and try and figure out, is there an issue here, right? Am I on or off track? How do I prioritize all the things that need to happen or the decisions that need to be made? So a KPI, I think, is a great way of starting to build the communications mechanism for that. It allows. Go ahead.
I would say though on that topic, Mike, is one of the things I've seen is you need to be very careful in terms of which KPIs you pick, especially in terms of progress. There are easy ways to cheat. For example, if you're trying to monitor how many contracts need to be exited, well, you do the easy ones first and you leave the hard ones last, right? So you need that qualitative information also to identify risk with the KPIs, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. It's a complete story, and I don't disagree. If it were just a numbers game, we could let AI do the whole thing, right? That would be the easy piece. But we know this is
maybe one day.
It's pretty sensitive. Maybe one day. I don't know if we'll get AI to be to have some of those human skills, right? We've talked about the integration lead being the hardest job because you really don't control anything, but you are responsible for all the outcomes and you influence everything. And that's a huge piece there. So we've got the first problem is the progress report. We've got the second, it's kind of this litany of lists of things. How do you start pulling it all together? How do you prepare an integration lead to navigate through this really frothy spot that's progress and a bunch of non-connected risks and issues?
I mean, for me, it's a case of, well, I mean, from a human perspective, bring everybody together, right? Actually start to actually log these things, put them out in the open so that people can actually see what's going on, and make sure that those risks are being discussed as a team, right? These are not, as we talked about before, these are sometimes cross-functional things. Yeah. So actually make sure that people are communicating and explaining and re-explaining as time goes on. I've seen time and time again, people assume that other people know what they're talking about. Maybe they did in the last meeting, but they've forgotten. So I think you have to over communicate sometimes on risk. I think the other way that you start to put control around this topic is you put in a framework of escalation to make sure that risks are dealt with in the right way and at the right level. And then you have some cultural aspects as well there in terms of how are you actually going to create that psychological safety to allow people to raise things, to voice their concerns, and be willing to say, hey, we might have a problem here, or hey, I think your work stream might have a problem here because of what I'm doing, or my work stream has a problem with because of what you're doing, and just getting it out there, right? I think that's key. And then the last piece is around the systems that you talked about previously, is just building out those systems, those processes, those forms of governance to make sure that it is clear how these things are raised, how they're escalated, and then also the decision framework, right? How do you address these things?
Let's start with the escalation. I love that framing of it. So how do you, or what kinds of things have you done to ensure there's the right escalation and the right delegation, right? There's some risks that you don't necessarily want someone to have, like, oh, we didn't get the PO out on Tuesday, it needed to be out by Thursday, right? That's not a catastrophic risk to that business, but that might be something that the team would spend time talking to. What kinds of tools have you used to ensure the team knows when and how to escalate and when and how to deal with those risks at a more functional or sub-functional level?
So I think there's a couple of things in that, right? So from my point of view, the first one is the design of how you actually capture some of these things. So you categorize some of these risks. Are they economic? Are they political? What are they, right? What are they actually going to impact? And ideally, if you can, put a monetary value on them, so you can actually identify how big is this problem, and also what are you actually going to do about it, right? So as part of the design of the logs, where you capture these things, I think it's really important to make sure that you can say, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to avoid it? Are you going to accept that it exists? Or are you going to address it, right? Are you going to mitigate it somehow? Or are you going to outsource the problem somehow? But actually categorizing what is the tangible action. And then I would say the other thing that's absolutely critical is that escalation flow, right? So what are things that actually people are empowered by the organizational levels or by program design to deal with themselves? What are the things that must be bubbled up based on criteria in the log to the workstream level? And typically, what I've seen is if you can't handle something within your own workstream, or it's beyond your delegated authority or your ability to actually control it, that has to go to at least the program level. And then the program can assess and triage and use their TMO function, their transformation management office function, to drive insight and analyze and understand what needs to be raised beyond to C-level or the board or wherever these things need to go. But I think it's a system of escalations, and I think it really starts from that bottom tier and bubbles up. And it's also about urgency. Sometimes a risk becomes an issue because no one's dealt with it for so long. So I think there's another reason to have a TMO office and just make sure that things that are not moving start to be prioritized as something that people need to look at. And sometimes I think the how do you deal with this stuff, right, is you actually have to drag it out. And as a program lead, as a TMO lead, you have to just get people in a room and really talk things through. I don't think there's anything that beats open communication and having that, as I said before, psychological safety to be willing and open to talk about these things and really take ownership of solving these things. How about you, Mike?
No, I love the point of getting back to value, right? I'm value obsessed. So it's always a prioritization by value. So now how do you actually place the value is one of the things that we've struggled with for years. And we found that going back to that system approach, right? That kind of whole business, I have to turn cash to cash flow, by inverting that and taking it away from a functional conversation and much more to a business objective or outcome conversation. I'll give you a quick example. So I'm working in HR. I use HR a lot because it's about the people, right? I'm working in HR and identify that there might be a skills gap. There might be a retention risk associated with that business. If I have a sales force that's going to walk out the door, I could tie that right back to the business objectives of the synergy sales and maintaining the core sales. And now I could prioritize that from a business perspective. But a lot of those retention risks are going to be cross function as well, right? So even though I'm HR and I'm talking about sales, that's going to affect that commercial work stream. So making sure you've got a single log to capture all of that. One of the common things I see happening is most people believe the RAID log is a deliverable, right? And they take an approach that says, well, I don't want a lot of risks on my RAID log, right? Because it makes it feel like there's a lot of work, right? We got that plus the reds is the big challenge. So you end up muting a lot of that evidence or that information that's there. And the role of that integration manager is to curate that, to cross tab that and understand, how do I elevate these things and then escalate them to where I can point to a value number that's a fairly sizable amount of value that's at risk. And that whole framing of value at risk, I found, is a much better way of talking about risks than just talking about the risks themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think typically in program management, right, what are these things articulated as? Well, if it impacts time or it impacts quality or whatever, but the value point is key, right? Because even if something slips, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to impact value, or it might impact it tremendously. I'd say the other thing you touched upon there is making sure there's one log, right? So I do think it's important to have a system, right? Ideally an IT system that's transparent to everyone, is easy to access, not Excel. Excel does work if you've got a small program going, but I think an IT system is better for things that need to be escalated. That doesn't mean you can't have a local log of some form to capture all the other things that you mentioned there that actually you can cover intra work stream. But I do think that an IT system does often help. And actually, it just makes it easier to then flag things up for escalation. And you can see that if there's a compounding effect. So if one work stream has 3 risks and they're dealing with them, that's not an issue. If another work stream has 1,000 risks, they may not be able to deal with it, not because of the impact of any individual risk, but because of the true volume. And I think that's a real red flag, and that just tells you that the system is broken, right? And you just need to find a different way of dealing with it. But I think I do see a world where most things should be logged, just so that they can be acknowledged and accepted, but obviously not the minutia, right? If an invoice is delayed or whatever, that's a BAU problem that just needs to be solved. So
yeah, and there is an art to that, but that whole element of it's a single place where we're capturing that, and that just really gets us to the prioritized list of risks and issues. And I do think there are a lot of great tools. I've used everything from Airtable and Notion. We've used some of the Microsoft tools that are around more table or database driven that allow, and then there's third-party tools for getting those consolidated RAID logs. But having that one list, but now you have to do something about it, right? And what we've typically done is we started to think about it in the form of, I could either avoid the risk. In some cases, on the early part of a deal, I just had a deal fall apart because we decided too much risk there. Let's just avoid the risk. Don't do the deal. But you're often not at a point where even avoiding the risk is at a structural level. But you start thinking about, do I even put these two systems together, or do I even try and smash these two departments together? And you just say, you know what? Too hard. Avoid it. Avoid the risk associated with that. That's the first layer. The second, we typically, if you've decided not to avoid it, you now have to think about, do I just accept it and acknowledge that it's on the RAID log and I'll visit it at some later date, or do I actually do something to address it? So what are you typically seeing in that workflow or that process in the integrations you've been working on?
yeah, I mean, I would say in a lot of cases, everyone just wants to mitigate everything. And I think that categorization is absolutely critical, right? Because I think the categorization actually allows you to take a proactive decision in terms of what are you actually going to do. And I do think sometimes when you avoid things, you have to revisit them. So the other thing I've seen in large scale integrations and in generally in complex programs is people say, well, we're just not gonna worry about this one for now. But actually, what does for now mean, right? It means that if it starts to become more critical, or it starts to actually materialize, you may have to do something about it, right? I mean, in your example, you walk away as an option and it's never going to materialize. Sometimes you may actually say, well, actually, this is so unlikely, I'm not going to worry about it. I mean, take the pandemic as an example, right? I mean, that was a bit of a challenge, right? And nobody expected it to come. But as soon as it looks more real, you're going to have to do something about it. And then you're going to have to build a mitigation plan or decide to outsource or take other action, right? I mean, sometimes even from an IT system perspective, it's, well, let's put in a manual process or let's do something that is completely different from what the plan was, because we don't have enough time to actually deal with these things. So, but I think it's spot on. I think it has to be a proactive decision in terms of what are you actually going to do, and continuous monitoring and driving that insight. And a lot of cases, I think this stuff is about looking at those options, right? What could we do about this? What are the consequences and the unintended consequences of some of the things that we're trying to do, and therefore what are we actually going to do to clear it up?
So now we get a RAID log, right? It's one solid RAID log. We've got a means of thinking about how are we going to deal with those risks, right? Now it comes back to the red, right? So where did the red, yellow, green aspect play out on this? And what are some of the things you're seeing now? If you sat as a team and you socialized, here's all of the risks and issues. It's in one consolidated place. Everybody can review them. We've curated them down, prioritized them by value, and we now have a mitigation action towards those, right? So something might be like, make sure we've converted the contracts, or that we've gotten all the consents, or that we have terminated contracts, like you were talking about in terms of trying to get some of the benefit when you consolidate to get some of the synergies. What happens now, or in that meeting? It's that third meeting again, and the first red appears on that list. What happens?
So for me, it really is a case of understanding what is it, so that there's no doubt, right? So if it's the first time that it's there, it's actually explaining, this is the actual problem, here's the impacts we see. And these meetings aren't about just status, right? They're about also communicating to other work streams that this is what might be coming, and you need to go and impact assess what it actually means. I think the second thing that needs to happen is to say, well, okay, what are we actually, how are we going to do? What is a tangible action? How are we going to monitor it? And then you change it into a decision, right? I mean, like we said before, is, okay, well, what decisions are required to actually solve this? And then if these are sponsor meetings, then the sponsor can actually make the decision then and there. Or if they need more information, then we can walk away and go build out whatever information is required to make an informed decision. But I think those are really the core steps around this. You need to communicate, you need to understand, and then you need to drive for a decision as fast as possible. And then outside of just risks, you then need to log those decisions. I've seen time and time again when decisions are made, they're not logged. And then what happens is people forget. And then decisions are reopened and they have a different decision that's made, which then causes severe implications in terms of business process, IT system, or business continuity in itself, right? So I think those are fundamental in terms of approach.
No, and I believe you kind of captured a whole bunch of things there, and I love the decision aspect to it. Like, what decision do we need to make? I always have been, from early military days when I was there, a red is not a sign of competence or a sign of capability. A red is a real assessment that there's something that needs a decision to be made. And some of those decisions could be, divert those resources elsewhere, right? Reinforce places where you have success. You see a lot of this in commercial, or you might see this in HR or finance, where you can shift things that allow for you to divert those resources or add more resources, right? There's some decision power to that red on the box. But we still see very, very few people willing to put the red on the box. And I think that comes down to culture. So how do you train your sponsors to not react in a way that creates a reticence or a reluctance to basically say, look, this is red here?
So number one, information is power, right? So I think you have to start there and actually teach the sponsors that we expect to see red, and we actually actively encourage red things to come up, because those are the things we must deal with, and it just allows us to differentiate between the hundreds of things that are out there. So I think that's the first point. I think the second one is around. I mean, sometimes there are very uncomfortable decisions that actually need to be made. So I think highlighting that these are going to be those things, and actually they need utter focus and they need more working time. And I think it's just helping the sponsor sift through all the other things that are out there, right? I mean, I think that's key. I think the other one is educating the entire program team in terms of how risk management actually works, how the escalation paths work, and how everything else works. And then it comes down to exec sponsorship, and it comes down to managing upwards and making sure that people outside of these massive programs understand that this is what is going to happen. And then standing behind it as an integration lead, you have to stand there and say, well, this is expected, right? And actually flagging potentially in the first few meetings that this is what we're expecting to happen. This is normal, and this is here to help. And it's that, I guess, that psychological safety and being willing to stand up if somebody says, hey, we don't report red here from a cultural perspective. I think it's having the willingness to stand up and say, well, in these programs we do, and unfortunately that's how we're going to drive this, or we can't actually get to a successful outcome. So I think it's about courage, it's about consistency, it's about visibility, and it's about having that safety to tell the truth. I think without that, I think most folks are in trouble. And I do think that there is something to be said about criteria. So if the criteria is clearly outlined in terms of what constitutes a red, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, then I think that also helps articulate the red, because it removes judgment from saying, well, is it or isn't it, right? But that's not always possible because of the complexity of these things. So that would be my thoughts on that. And I think it's just educating everybody that risk isn't something people need to be afraid of. It's an opportunity to ask for help. It's an opportunity to get the focus it deserves. And it's an opportunity to really save yourself, if nothing else, and say, hey, a problem shared is a problem halved, as they say, or I think they say, right? So, I mean, the problem may not be halved, but at least the focus is in the right place and can be used to resolve these things.
No, you said a couple of really powerful things there, right? And as we've been talking, the kind of uncurated list, that kind of long box of Legos have been dropped on the table without curation, no means of prioritizing by value, using that as a way. And then what I've found is that systems approach allows us to really put those on in two levels. One, the first is framing and naming, right? So from a framing perspective, I can now frame this as something that goes back to those original hunches. Hey, I think I could get this much commercial upsell. I think there's going to be this much of kind of joint sales. I think there's going to be this much of shared or saved benefit. Right, whatever those things are, once you frame them against a business objective, I could now go back to then naming them. And I've used a common approach that we use when I'm working with teams is we basically start framing those so that everyone could run their own versions of those risks, but they all consolidate to a common language. And that's determining, is this a market risk? Is this an execution risk? Is this an adoption risk? Is this a team risk, tech risk, investment risk, reputation risk, or a regulatory risk, right? Just putting that amount. So when I'm curating, I could start to see where are there market risks across those different work streams or silos. So the framing and naming piece is one thing that we found has been really important, right? Framing it against those business objectives and then naming it against the type of risk that's actually there.
Absolutely. Mike, I think we're approaching time, unfortunately, but it's been great to have you and really excellent points, I think. So it's a fantastic
great
conversation.
No, it is. And, again, leaving folks with something they could to work on. We talked about the communications piece in our last. That's critical, absolutely critical. And then starting to think about, well, how do you create a common language and then, put the decisions first approach on that. But again, great session. I'm looking forward to our next one. Thanks for having me.
So am I. Great to have you.
Good to see you.